They called him the Holy Flame. Pastor Nduka could touch the dying and watch death run away like a thief caught stealing. That Sunday morning, when he placed his trembling hands on little Chitty's twisted legs, the whole church stopped breathing. The boy had never walked, not one step in his 7 years of life. His mother had carried him everywhere, her back bent, her tears endless. But when Pastor Nduka closed his eyes and whispered his prayer, something shifted. The air grew thick. The boy's legs straightened slowly, bone cracking into place like dry wood snapping. Then Chitty stood. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. The church exploded. Women fainted. Men wept. Children screamed with joy. They lifted the pastor high, calling him prophet, calling him miracle worker, calling him God's own messenger sent to save Okoroma. But if only they knew what he had buried 3 nights before beneath the old fig tree behind the church. If only they had seen him digging in the dark with trembling hands, whispering prayers in a language that made the earth shiver. If only they had heard what answered him from below, then they would have known that some miracles are bought with blood. Behind the church stood a fig tree that refused to die. Its roots went deep, twisting into the earth like fingers searching for something buried long ago. The branches hung low and thick, blocking out the sun even at noon. Under it, nothing grew. No grass, no flowers, only pale mushrooms after the rain. Mama Adana, the oldest woman in Okoroma, watched the tree every day from her veranda. When her granddaughter Ngozi played near the church, the old woman's voice would crack through the air like a whip. "Ngozi, stay away from that tree." "But Grandma, it's just a tree," the girl would say confused. Mama Adana's eyes would darken. "That tree is not just anything. It drinks from things we cannot see. My own grandmother warned me never to let my shadow touch its roots. That tree remembers when this land belonged to something else, something that still waits below." Ngozi didn't understand, but she obeyed. Still, sometimes at night, she heard sound from that direction. Whispers carried on wind that wasn't blowing. And once, she swore she heard crying coming from beneath those ancient branches, soft and sad like a child lost in the dark. Obinna was 23, but looked older. Digging graves does that to a man. He had no family, no home except the small room behind the church where Pastor Nduka let him stay. In exchange, Obinna kept the churchyard clean and never asked questions. He was grateful. 2 years ago, the pastor had found him sleeping under a bridge, hungry and forgotten. The pastor gave him work, food, and purpose. So Obinna worked quietly, head down, hands busy, asking nothing. But that Tuesday night changed everything. Obinna had stayed late, fixing a broken fence near the graveyard. The moon hung full and bright, painting everything silver. He was gathering his tools when he heard footsteps on dry leaves. He looked up and his heart stopped. Pastor Nduka walked toward the fig tree, carrying a lantern in one hand. In the other, wrapped carefully in white cloth, was something small, something that bulged strangely in the middle. The pastor's face looked different in the moonlight, harder, like a mask had slipped. Obinna ducked behind a tombstone, his breath caught in his throat. He knew he should leave, should look away, but his eyes stayed open, watching what no one was meant to see. Pastor Nduka stopped beneath the fig tree and set the lantern down. The light made his shadow grow tall and twisted against the trunk. He knelt slowly and began digging with his bare hands, clawing at the soil with desperate urgency. Obinna watched from behind the tombstone, his heart pounding so loud he feared it would give him away. The pastor dug deeper, deeper, until the hole was wide enough. Then he reached for the white bundle and held it carefully, almost tenderly. He began to speak, but the words weren't Igbo, weren't English, weren't any language Obinna had ever heard. The sounds were thick and wet, like something pulled from deep water. They made Obinna's skin crawl and his stomach turn cold with fear. The pastor placed the bundle into the hole. The moment it touched the bottom, the earth shivered, just slightly, like a sleeper stirring from a long dream. Pastor Nduka covered it quickly, smoothing the dirt with trembling palms. He whispered one final word that sounded like a name, like a promise. Then he stood and walked back toward the church, leaving his lantern burning beside the freshly turned soil. Obinna stayed frozen long after the pastor disappeared, staring at the ground that seemed to pulse with hidden life. That night, Obinna couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pastor's face in the moonlight, heard those strange wet words dripping from his mouth. He lay on his thin mat, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself it meant nothing. Maybe it was a holy ritual, maybe something sacred, maybe Obinna had misunderstood. But then he heard it, faint at first, like wind through cracks. Then clearer, voices, soft, distant, coming from outside, coming from the direction of the fig tree. Obinna sat up, cold sweat soaking his shirt. The voices sounded like children calling from far away, calling for help, calling to be found, calling his name. He stumbled to his window and looked out. The churchyard was empty. The moon had hidden behind clouds. Everything was dark and still. Yet the voices continued, rising and falling like a sad song sung underwater. By morning, Obinna had convinced himself it was a dream, just a nightmare born from watching something he didn't understand. But when he stepped outside to sweep, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The ground beneath the fig tree was warm. Steam rose faintly from the soil, even though the morning air was cool. And somewhere deep below, something pulsed like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Within days, Pastor Nduka's miracles multiplied like bread at a wedding feast. A woman barren for 12 years felt life stirring in her womb. A blind trader touched the pastor's robe and screamed when colors exploded into his darkness. A man whose arm had been paralyzed since childhood lifted it above his head and wept like a child. The church could barely hold the crowds. People came from neighboring towns carrying their sick on mats, their disabled in wheelbarrows, their dying in their arms. They pressed money into Pastor Nduka's hands. They brought goats, bags of rice, envelopes fat with cash. The pastor smiled gently, accepting everything with humble words. "It is not me," he would say softly. "It is God working through this unworthy vessel." The people loved him even more for his humility. But Obinna noticed things others missed. The pastor's eyes had grown darker, restless, always searching the crowd as if counting something invisible. He never looked at the fig tree anymore, as if avoiding an old friend who knew too many secrets. And the donations. Every week, more money poured in. The church expanded. New benches arrived. The roof was repaired. Pastor Nduka bought a car, then another. The miracle man was becoming a very wealthy man, blessed beyond measure. Mama Yugo was 73 years old and afraid of nothing. She had survived 3 husbands, outlived most of her children, and claimed she could see things hidden from normal eyes. The villagers called her a prophet, though some whispered she was something older, something closer to spirits than to God. One Sunday, she stood up in the middle of Pastor Nduka's sermon. Her voice cut through the church like a knife through cloth. Something dead walks among the living. The church fell silent. Pastor Nduka stopped mid-sentence, his smile frozen on his face. "Mama Yugo," he said gently, his voice like honey, "please sit down. You're disturbing God's service." "I will not sit while darkness wears holy robes," she said, her eyes burning with ancient fire. "The miracles in this place are bought with blood. I have seen it in my dreams. The river goddess is awake, and she is hungry for more than prayers." Gasps rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Pastor Nduka's face hardened. "This woman is confused," he declared loudly. "Evil fears the righteous and sends confusion to distract us. Do not listen to her lies." 2 men gently escorted Mama Yugo out. But as she passed the pastor, she whispered loud enough for those nearby to hear, "The tree remembers what you buried. Soon it will speak." The river beside Okoroma began to change. At first, nobody paid attention. Rivers shift sometimes, people said. Seasons affect water. But this was different. The water grew darker, thicker, like something was bleeding into it from underneath. The fish that once jumped silver in the sunlight now floated belly up near the banks, their eyes clouded white and blind. Women who washed clothes complained that the water left strange stains that soap couldn't remove. And the smell. A faint, sour smell hung in the air near the riverbank, especially at night. It reminded people of rot, of things left too long in the ground, of secrets the earth couldn't keep buried. The elders held a meeting. They decided the gods must be angry about something. They prepared sacrifices, chickens, palm wine, cola nuts. They laid them by the river's edge with prayers and songs. But the river didn't change. If anything, it grew worse, darker, more restless. Mama Adana told anyone who would listen that the river was trying to warn them. It flows past the church, she said, pointing with a trembling finger. Past that cursed fig tree. The water knows what the soil knows. It carries the truth downstream. But most people dismissed her words. They were too busy celebrating miracles to worry about a dying river. Besides, Pastor Nduka assured them that prayer would fix everything. Little Kayamika was 7 years old with a voice like morning bells ringing clear across the village. She sang in the church choir every Sunday, standing in the front row where everyone could see her bright smile. Her mother called her my joy. Her father called her my heart. On Thursday evening, after choir practice, Kayamika stayed behind to help Sister Blessing arrange them books. The other children ran home, their laughter fading into the evening. Go on home now, Sister Blessing told her kindly. I'll finish up here. Okay, sister, Kayamika said, skipping toward the door, her small feet light on the wooden floor. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. By nightfall, her parents were frantic. They searched the market, the school, every neighbor's compound. They walked the roads calling her name until their voices went hoarse and broken. The whole village joined the search, combing through bushes, checking every corner, questioning everyone who might have seen something. Pastor Nduka led a prayer vigil that night. Hundreds gathered, holding candles, singing hymns, begging God to return the child safely. The pastor's voice shook with emotion as he prayed. Tears rolled down his face like rain. But as he prayed with closed eyes and raised hands, he never once looked toward the back of the church. Never once glanced at the fig tree whose branches swayed gently in the windless night. Obinna couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Kayamika's face haunted him, that bright singing child now swallowed by silence and mystery. Deep in his chest, a terrible suspicion grew like a weed that refused to die. He kept remembering that night under the moon, the white bundle, the strange wet prayers, the earth shivering as if swallowing something alive and warm. Could it be? Could the pastor have? No, impossible. Pastor Nduka was a man of God. He healed people. He fed the poor. He saved Obinna from the streets. He wouldn't harm a child. He couldn't. But what if? Obinna tried to pray, but the words stuck in his throat like stones he couldn't swallow. He tried to convince himself he was wrong, that grief was making him see evil where only holiness lived. Yet that night, Obinna had a dream that felt too real to be only sleep. He stood beneath the fig tree in darkness. The roots began to move, twisting upward, breaking through the soil like fingers clawing for air and freedom. From beneath the ground came Kayamika's voice, small and afraid, and so very far away. Uncle Obinna, why didn't you help me? Why didn't you stop him? He woke up screaming, his mat soaked with sweat and terror. The moon shone through his window, cold and accusing. Outside, he heard it again, that same faint crying from the direction of the fig tree. Midnight came heavy and silent, pressing down on Okoroma like a hand covering a mouth. The moon hung full and bright, casting sharp shadows across the churchyard. Obinna stood in his doorway, a lantern in one trembling hand, a shovel in the other, his whole body shaking with fear and purpose. He walked slowly toward the fig tree, each step feeling like betrayal. Betrayal of what? His loyalty to the pastor? His gratitude? Or betrayal of the truth he'd been too afraid to face? When he reached the tree, he stood for a long moment, staring at the ground. The soil looked normal, undisturbed, innocent. But he knew better. He'd watched the pastor dig right here, right in this exact spot where nothing would grow. He drove the shovel into the earth. The sound of metal cutting soil seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, like a scream in a sleeping house. Obinna worked quickly, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool night air. The deeper he dug, the colder it became. His breath came out in white clouds. Then his shovel hit something solid. Not a rock. Something wooden. Something that shouldn't be buried there. His hands shook as he cleared away the remaining dirt. There, 2 feet below the surface, was a small wooden box. Too small for an adult. Just the right size for a child. Obinna's stomach twisted. He wanted to run, to bury it again and pretend he'd never seen it. The box was old, carved with strange symbols that seemed to move and shift in the lantern light. Obinna set it gently on the ground, his hands trembling so badly he could barely grip the edges. His mind screamed at him to stop, to walk away, to leave this secret buried where it belonged. But Kayamika's voice echoed in his memory. He had to know. He opened the box. Inside, nestled in white cloth stained rust-red with old blood, was a human heart. Small, a child's heart, and impossibly, terribly it was beating. The heart pulsed slowly, rhythmically, as if it still lived inside a chest, as if it still belonged to someone who waited in the dark. Obinna stumbled backward, a scream caught in his throat like a bird trapped in a cage. The heart beat once, twice, 3 times, each pulse visible under the stained cloth. Then, impossibly, he heard a voice. Not from the box. Not from anywhere outside. The voice came from inside his head, clear and small and heartbreakingly familiar. He took me for your peace. Kayamika's voice. He took me so the church could grow, so the miracles wouldn't stop. He took me and buried me under the tree, and now I'm trapped. I can't leave. I can't rest. I can't go home to Mama. The voice broke into sobs that echoed in Obinna's skull, tearing at his mind and heart. Obinna scrambled away from the box, turned, and ran. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like water. He locked himself in his room, pressed his back against the door, and slid to the floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come fast enough. His mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of what he'd seen, what he'd heard. But he knew. Deep down, in the place where truth lives beyond doubt, he knew. Pastor Nduka wasn't a miracle worker sent from heaven. He was a murderer. He had killed Kayamika, buried her heart under the fig tree as some kind of offering, some terrible price paid for power. And from that sacrifice, miracles flowed like poison water. The healings, the blessings, the prosperity, all of it bought with blood, all of it paid for with innocent life. Obinna covered his face with his hands and wept. For Kayamika, for the town that worshipped a devil dressed in holy robes. For himself, who had stayed silent when he first saw the pastor digging in the moonlight. That night, sleep came in broken pieces filled with terrible dreams. Or maybe not dreams. Maybe memories that belonged to someone else, planted in his mind by a voice that wouldn't rest. He saw Kayamika walking behind the church after choir practice. Saw Pastor Nduka calling to her gently. Come, my child, help me with something. Saw her follow trustingly. Saw the pastor's face change when they reached the tree. Saw his hand cover her mouth. Saw the knife flash silver in the moonlight. Mama Yugo lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, where the forest began to whisper its ancient secrets. When Obinna came to her door just after dawn, wild-eyed and trembling like a man chased by demons, she didn't look surprised. I've been expecting you, she said quietly, stepping aside to let him enter her home. Obinna told her everything. The burial he'd witnessed, the voices in the night, the box he'd uncovered, Kayamika's heart still beating in the ground, trapped between life and death. When he finished, Mama Yugo closed her eyes and nodded slowly, as if hearing a story she'd always known would come. You've uncovered a very old evil, she said, lighting a candle that made shadows dance on the walls. Older than Pastor Nduka, older than this church. She sat across from him, her ancient eyes reflecting the candlelight. This land once belonged to a river goddess named Ogbanj. She lived in the water and demanded respect from those who took from a river. When the missionaries came generations ago, they built their church on her sacred ground, right over her shrine. They thought they'd conquered her with prayers and holy water. They were wrong. Mama Yugo's voice dropped to a whisper that made Obinna's skin crawl. The goddess went deep underground, waiting in the dark places. Years later, Pastor Nduka arrived with prayers on his lips and greed burning in his heart. He was failing, desperate. So he went searching for power in forbidden places, and he found her. That night, Pastor Nduka couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, his heart racing for no reason he could name or understand. Everything was perfect. His church overflowed with people every Sunday. Money poured in like rain during the wet season. His name was spoken with reverence across 3 towns and beyond. So why did he feel watched? Why did the air in his room feel thick with invisible eyes? He closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come, as if heaven itself had stopped listening. Instead, he heard something else. Whispers, faint at first, then growing louder, clearer, more insistent. Voices he recognized. Kayamika's voice, small and confused. Why, Pastor? An old man's voice, his first offering 2 years ago. You promised to heal my son instead. A teenage girl's voice from 6 months past. I trusted you with my confession. Pastor Nduka sat up, sweat soaking his nightshirt until it clung to his skin. The room was empty, dark, silent. But the voices continued, circling him like flies around spoiled meat, buzzing with accusation and pain. And then he heard her, the voice beneath all the others. Ancient, patient, eternally hungry. Your offering is due, Nduka. He knew that voice intimately. It was the same one that had answered him 3 years ago when he knelt by the river, desperate and broken, and begged for help, for power, for anything to save his failing ministry. Sunday morning arrived with heavy clouds that pressed down on Okoroma like a lid on a boiling pot. The church filled quickly as always, people pressing shoulder to shoulder, singing praises with uplifted hands and closed eyes. Pastor Nduka stood at the altar, his Bible open, his smile bright and practiced. But behind his eyes, exhaustion lived like a permanent guest. The choir began near him, children's voices rising sweet and pure toward the rafters. Then, without warning, the wind changed. It came from nowhere, a sudden gust that blew through the church, even though all the windows were shut and locked. The candles flickered wildly and went out, one by one. The singing faltered, then stopped completely. One of the choir girls, a small child named Adiz, began to shake violently. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, blank and terrible. Her mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was older, sadder, more broken. It was Kayamika's voice speaking through borrowed lips. He killed me. The church gasped as one body. Adiz's mother rushed forward, but the girl didn't respond, didn't even blink. She stood rigid, her head tilted at an unnatural angle that made people step back in fear. He buried me under the tree. My heart still beats in the ground. I can't leave. I can't rest. He feeds the goddess with our blood, and you call it miracle. Pastor Nduka's face went pale as death. This is spiritual attack, he shouted, his voice cracking. Fear spread through Okoroma like fire through dry grass. Half the congregation stopped coming to church, their faith shaken by what they'd witnessed. Rumors flew like startled birds. Kayamika's voice speaking through Adiz, the river growing darker each day. Strange sounds behind the church at night that made dogs howl and children wake screaming. Pastor Nduka preached harder, his voice rising to a desperate shout each Sunday. He blamed the doubters, blamed weak faith, blamed Satan's attacks on a righteous ministry growing too powerful for hell to ignore. This is spiritual warfare, he declared from the pulpit, sweat running down his face. The enemy fears our growth and sends confusion to scatter us like sheep. We must fast. We must pray without ceasing. We must bind every demonic force trying to destroy what God has built here. Some people believed him. They fasted for 3 days, drinking only water, praying through the nights until their voices went hoarse. They called out demons by name, rebuked darkness with scripture, claimed victory over invisible enemies. But nothing changed. If anything, Things grew worse with each passing day. More children woke screaming from nightmares about voices calling from under the ground, begging to be found. Crops began to fail for reasons no farmer could explain. Livestock died suddenly with no signs of disease. The river continued to darken, its water thick and foul-smelling. And every night, Pastor Nduka returned to the fig tree, kneeling in the darkness, whispering desperately to the soil that had swallowed his secrets. Obinna waited until Pastor Nduka left for a revival meeting in a nearby town. Then he moved quickly, his heart pounding with fear and purpose. The pastor's living quarters were behind the church, a small building with a locked door. Obinna had cleaned that room countless times. He knew where the spare key hung hidden behind a loose brick. His hand shook as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was neat, almost unnaturally so. Nothing out of place. A Bible on the desk, its pages well-worn. A cross on the wall. Everything a pastor's room should contain. Everything proper and holy. But Obinna knew what he was looking for. He'd seen the pastor writing in something late at night through the window. He searched the drawers, the closet, under the bed. Nothing. Then he noticed the floorboard near the window. One board sat slightly higher than the others, as if recently disturbed. He pried it up carefully with trembling fingers. Beneath it lay a black leather book, worn smooth by repeated handling. Obinna lifted it out, his stomach tight with dread. The cover was soft, ancient. He opened it slowly, afraid of what he might find. Inside were drawings, strange symbols, circles within circles, words in that same unknown language he'd heard the pastor speak beneath the tree, and lists, names written in neat handwriting, each one a person, a life, a soul. Kayamika Okafor, March 15th. Beside her name, offered. He recognized other names. People who had vanished over the past 2 years without explanation. The storm came that night without warning, as if the sky itself had finally broken from holding too many secrets. The clouds turned black as coal, and thunder shook the ground like war drums announcing battle. Lightning split the darkness, turning everything white for brief, terrible seconds that burned the eyes. Obinna ran toward the church through sheets of rain that soaked him instantly. He didn't know what drove him forward. Some instinct, some warning shouted by the wind itself, calling him to witness what was coming. When he reached the churchyard, he saw him through the rain and lightning. Pastor Nduka knelt beneath the fig tree, arms raised to the storm like Moses calling down plagues. He was chanting those strange words again, louder this time, desperate and pleading with something that answered from below. Lightning struck nearby, close enough that Obinna felt the heat singe his skin. In that flash of white light, he saw something that made his heart stop beating. The ground beneath the pastor was moving. Not like wind moving grass or rain moving soil. Like something underneath was trying to push through from below, trying to break free. The soil bulged upward in places, sank in others, as if the earth itself was breathing with lungs that had been buried too long. And the roots of the fig tree were glowing. A faint red light pulsed along them like blood pumping through veins, growing brighter with each of the pastor's desperate words. Then the ground split open with a sound like the world breaking. From the crack in the earth, red light spilled upward like water flowing against gravity. It wasn't fire, but it burned the eyes to look it directly. The light twisted and coiled in the air above the tree, forming shapes that almost looked human but weren't quite right, twisted by death and time and hunger. Pastor Nduka fell forward onto his hands, his body shaking violently. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I've given you everything you asked for. Please, just give me more time. Just a little more time." The light shifted and a voice spoke. Not through the air, through the ground itself, through the bones of the earth and the roots of the ancient tree. "Time!" The voice was female, ancient, amused by his pleading. "You borrowed time, little man. You borrowed power. You borrowed miracles. Now the debt is due, and payment must be made." From the glowing crack, hands began to emerge. Small hands, a child's hands reaching up from soil. Then more, arms pulling themselves toward the surface, grasping at the air, dragging bodies behind them. They were the ones he'd offered, the ones buried as seeds to grow his prosperity and fame. Kayamika's face appeared first, half her body rising from the earth. Her eyes were empty, hollow. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out except a whisper that was everywhere. Behind her, others crawled up from where they'd been planted. The old man, the pregnant woman, the homeless boy, all of them twisted by death and the goddess's hunger, reaching for the man who'd put them there. Pastor Nduka screamed and tried to run. The river began to rise without warning, not slowly like a normal flood, all at once, as if something had broken deep below the earth where water and darkness met. Water surged over the banks, rushing toward the church with impossible speed and terrible purpose. Obinna struggled to his feet, rain blinding him, wind pushing him backward with invisible hands. He watched in horror as the flood swept across the churchyard, swirling around the fig tree in circles that defied natural flow. But this wasn't ordinary water. It was thick, dark, filled with shapes that moved beneath the surface like thoughts swimming through the mind of something ancient. As it reached the tree, the shapes rose up, forming into something almost human. A woman. Tall, beautiful, terrible beyond words. The river goddess had come to collect what was owed. She stood in the flood, her body made of water and darkness and rage older than memory. Her eyes glowed like drowned stars pulled from the bottom of the deepest well. She looked down at Pastor Nduka, struggling in the grip of the dead children he'd sacrificed. "You called me when you were broken," she said, her voice like rivers over stone, like water wearing away mountains. "You begged for power when your ministry was dying. I gave it freely. I asked only for what was promised. A soul each moon. A life for each miracle. You agreed with eager words." Pastor Nduka wept, his voice small and broken. "I had no choice. My ministry was failing. I was nothing. I was nobody. And now you are less than nothing," the goddess replied without mercy. "You fed me well. I grew strong on your offerings." As the goddess reached for him with hands made of dark water, Pastor Nduka's life began to unfold like pages torn from a book and scattered in the wind. The memories spilled out, visible to everyone who watched through rain and lightning. Obinna saw it all, saw the truth laid bare. 3 years ago, Pastor Nduka's church was dying slowly. Only 5 people came to services. Deads piled high like stones building a tomb. People left one by one, their faith in him fading like morning mist. He prayed and prayed until his voice went hoarse, but heaven stayed silent. In desperation, he went to the river at midnight, ready to end everything in its dark waters. That's when she appeared, the goddess, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She rose from the water like a dream, like a nightmare, like an answer to prayers that should never have been spoken. She offered him a choice in a voice like drowning. "Power," she said. "Miracles beyond imagining. Prosperity that will make your name famous. Crowds that will worship at your feet. All yours for a simple price. Once each moon, bring me a life. Someone nobody will miss. Feed my hunger, and I will feed your ambition until it chokes you." He should have refused. Should have run. Should have chosen poverty over this terrible bargain. But hunger makes men foolish, and pride makes them blind to consequences. He agreed. He shook hand with darkness and called it blessing. The first offering was an old man dying of sickness anyway. He would have died soon, the pastor told himself, building lies to sleep at night. The river goddess lifted Pastor Nduka by his throat, her hand made of cold water that didn't spill or drip. She held him up to face the spirits of those he'd murdered, forcing him to see what his ambition had cost. "Look at them," she commanded. "Look at what your miracles were built upon." He looked, saw Kayamika's empty eyes staring at him, saw the others standing in silent accusation, their mouths open in screams that had no sound. "They trusted you," the goddess said. "They came to you for hope, for healing, for God. And you gave them to darkness for the price of applause." The pastor's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry." Kayamika's spirit tilted her head, mimicking life but not living. "You buried my heart, and watched my mother weep at my funeral. You prayed over my empty coffin, knowing I was beneath the tree. Sorry means nothing here. The goddess began to pull him toward the earth, toward the crack that led down into darkness forever. The opening widened, revealing blackness that went down and down with no bottom. But then Obinna moved. He didn't plan it, didn't think. He just ran forward through rain and fear, shouting, "Wait, please wait." The goddess turned, one eyebrow raised in curiosity. "Take him," Obinna said, falling to his knees in the mud. "He deserves whatever comes. But please, let the children rest. They've suffered enough. They're tired. End this for them. End all of it." The goddess studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled, and this smile was different, almost sad. The goddess nodded slowly, as if Obinna had spoken words she'd been waiting to hear. She released Pastor Nduka, and he fell to the mud, gasping and shaking. The spirits of the children moved toward him, their hands reaching, but not to harm this time. They touched his face gently, one by one, and as they did, something terrible and beautiful happened. Pastor Nduka aged, not slowly, rapidly, as if time itself had been waiting to collect its debt. His hair went white, then fell out in clumps. His skin wrinkled and sagged. His back bent double. In seconds, he became an old man, ancient beyond natural years. "I take not your life," the goddess said, her voice echoing across the storm. "I take your time. All the years you stole from them, I collect now. Live what remains. Live knowing what you are. Live with memories that will never fade or grant you peace." The spirits began to fade, their forms growing lighter, transparent, like morning mist burning away in sunlight. Kayamika looked at Obinna one last time and smiled. A real smile, grateful and free. Then she was gone, released at last from the ground that had held her captive. The crack in the earth closed slowly. The flood waters receded, flowing back toward the river. The red light dimmed and disappeared like a candle blown out by gentle breath. The goddess looked at Obinna one final time. "You freed them with courage when others chose comfortable blindness. The covenant is broken. I return to my river. Do not forget what lies beneath pretty words and holy faces." Then she melted into the water and was gone, flowing back to wherever ancient things wait and watch. When the rain stopped, dawn was breaking over Okoroma. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and new. The fig tree stood silent and still, its roots no longer glowing, its branches no longer whispering secrets to the wind. Pastor Nduka was found the next morning by the church entrance, aged beyond recognition, unable to speak or move. The authorities took him away to a place where the old and broken go to wait for death. The church was closed, its doors locked, its secrets finally exposed. The truth came out slowly, painfully, as these truths always do when they've been buried deep. Obinna told the elders everything he'd witnessed. They dug carefully around the fig tree and found the remains of those who had been offered as payment for miracles. 7 bodies, 7 souls stolen for prosperity and fame. The town mourned properly this time, burying them with prayers that meant something, with tears that washed away the lies. Kayamika's mother held her daughter's bones and wept until she had no tears left, finally able to grieve what she'd lost. Mama Yugo led the cleansing ritual. They cut down the fig tree and burned it until nothing remained but ashes. The ashes they scattered in the river as an apology to the goddess who had been defiled by greed dressed in holy robes. 3 months later, Obinna stood where the tree had been. In its place, white lilies grew, one for each child taken, one for each soul returned to rest. The townspeople had rebuilt the church, smaller this time, humbler, with no room for pride. They asked Obinna to keep watch over it, not as a pastor, as a keeper, a reminder of what happens when ambition forgets mercy, when miracles are bought instead of given freely. He planted more flowers around the lilies, tending them carefully. He prayed their sometimes quiet prayers without grand words or empty promises. And when children asked him about the flowers blooming where once a dark tree stood, he told them the truth simply. These grow where darkness once lived, he said gently. They remind us that faith is pure only when it needs no sacrifice, no blood, no secret burials. Evil often wears the face we trust most, speaks with the voice we want to hear, and hides behind robes that look holy in the light. The children listen with wide eyes, understanding in the way children do when truth is spoken plainly. If only the town had known what the pastor buried behind the church, Obinna would say, his voice sad but steady. But now we know. Now we remember. And in remembering, we stay awake. The flowers bloomed brighter each season, white as forgiveness, white as truth that can no longer be buried. And the river ran clear again, carrying its secrets to the sea, where all secrets eventually go to rest. Not every miracle is divine. Sometimes, light shines brightest just before it burns. Faith is pure when it needs no sacrifice. Evil often hides in holy robes.